Hey, everybody. It's Great Mondays Radio. Thank you so much for tuning back in. We've got a really special episode today. Um, Andre Plaut is a learning design strategist. He's worked for companies like General Assembly, Apple. I think I even saw that you worked for Obama a little bit. Is that true? Yeah.
That was sort of like a consulting volunteer thing, but yeah,
Yeah.
on the 2012 campaign.
Yeah. So, hey, whether you get paid or not, if you're doing that kind of work, you
It's
get to
true.
call it.
It's true.
And he now runs his own learning design strategy studio called Human Machine. And I have him on because he wrote this incredible piece. We talked. Um, he and I connected many years ago because he wanted to learn more about culture, and then he wrote this incredible piece that has kind of blown my mind about how to actually think about culture and applying it, the steps that you need to take or the phases that need to go into applying it and get it happening at your company. And so I'm gonna turn it over to Andre to say hello and kind of introduce himself and tell us if you're a learning design expert, why are you writing about culture?
Awesome. Um, Thank you so much for having me, Josh. It's so nice to chat again. I mentioned both to you sort of privately, but also online publicly that you were one of the first people I thought of when I was writing this piece. You were one of the first people to see it 4 years ago. So certainly a lot of your work and thoughts informed it as well. Um, so yeah, I'm Andre, and I'm a learning strategist and designer, and really where this framework came from. I'm sure we'll sort of go into like the details of it, but it was really kind of a brute force realization being a learning designer, being at that time the head of learning and development at an agency here in Brooklyn where I'm based, which is that when most leaders or teams or organizations experience some sort of organizational pain point, whether that's um, they're getting feedback that managers are not effective enough, or there's not enough feedback happening in the organization. One of the first places that they go to is their learning and development person or
Mm,
to some external training company. And the thinking is, well, we're
fix it.
having these problems. Yeah, fix it. Like people don't know how to manage, people don't know how to give feedback. We need to teach them how to do that. And that was my job as the head of learning and development at this agency. It was to teach people how to be great managers, how to give feedback. And every time I found myself in the room with those people, teaching them those skills, what I found was that it wasn't actually the lack of skills that were causing those problems. It was a whole lot of other stuff that was going on.
Mm,
That, in fact, I was talking to a room of people who cared deeply about being great managers and giving feedback, who actually had the skills to do it. But there were other factors, there were cultural factors, there was sort of a lack of policies, a lack of clear expectations of what it meant to be a great manager, of what it meant to give feedback across the organization, that basically led to those folks not being able to actually apply those skills or exhibit those skills.
mm,
And so it sort of started me on this journey of pulling this thread to figure out, okay, well, we have these programs, we have training and onboarding and all of these things that have infrastructure, and they're sort of lines on an expense report. Um, and they solve a very specific problem, which is that they help people learn new information, pick up new skills, they get to practice those skills. And I love that. That my whole career has been about creating those kinds of programs.
hmm
But it was very clear to me that they were not a silver bullet. They were not the one and only thing that could solve a problem across the organization.
hmm
And what I cared about even more than like justifying my job was actually solving the problem. I really wanted to solve these really deep organizational issues. And I realized that in order to truly solve them, we needed to look elsewhere, and we need to sort of broaden our lens beyond just programs and actually look at, yeah, how is our culture set up so that it's actually encouraging this kind of behavior? What are the sort of policies that we put in place, so that we're making those cultural norms and values really explicit, so that it's not just an unspoken expectation that you're going to give feedback or do one-on-ones, but that we actually set that expectation pretty early on. And then how do we actually build programs that support those values and that culture and those policies? And then lastly, how are we sort of providing folks the right tools to be able to do that, right? So if we're saying great feedback is specific and actionable, in the length of a day or a week or a month of work, a million things are happening. It's really hard to give specific feedback if you
Yeah.
don't have a place to capture what you're
Yeah.
seeing and the impact. And so that's where tools come in. So basically, I started to see all of these different gaps that weren't being addressed. And that's where this came from.
So there's a tendency to simplify just because, our brain is constantly working and exerting energy. And so it's the premise that, oh, these people must not have the knowledge, not have the information that they need to be, and in this case, a good manager. But and I'm just sort of recapping, make sure I understand. And what you observed is no, they actually had that knowledge or were able to absorb that knowledge. And so, in fact, these programs weren't doing their job even if you put that money and energy into it. And I know, every organization has an L&D group or budget, and it's like that money is like, it's clearly they want to do it, but you're discovering in this process that actually that in and of itself isn't enough. So when you talk about the the things that get in the way, do you have an example? And then we can get into the model in just a second, because I love models. I love your model. And I'll describe it and you can
Yeah.
correct it for me. But let's talk about what the problem that you see or you have seen. What is an example? Because what I really want is for people to nod their head and go, "Oh, yeah, yeah, I've seen that too." Or like, "Oh, I didn't realize that's what that was."
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think the problem was the one, the clearest example for me was the problem that initially kind of sparked this idea, which had to do with management culture and expectations, and this kind of assumption that, well, folks maybe don't know how to be managers when in fact they did. And I think really specifically, it was realizing that when you've set up a culture, whether it's intentional or not, and that's something that you talk about a lot, is the sort of intentionality or the design aspect of designing a culture versus kind of
Letting it happen to you.
exactly. Or as I sort of call it, like it's a default culture, right? It's the sort
Mm-hmm.
of culture that just
The great
like
way to put it.
weeds kind of spring up, and you're sort of choosing not to care for it and manicure it and plant things. What I had realized is that the default culture that it's set up in this organization was one in which, and I think I actually find this really common. I don't want to like sort of focus just on this one organization. I actually see this with a lot of clients, and especially a lot of sort of startup and tech folks and organizations, with this idea that, well, we want to be flat. We want to be a flat organization, which has plenty of benefits, but without making it explicit what we mean by flat, what what are we actually talking about? What is that culturally? What is that from a policy perspective? What you, I think, end up communicating to folks is we want to reduce management. We don't want to do management
Yeah, we don't
things.
want to spend the time and energy on the management of people. We just want the people to do the work.
Exactly. Yeah, it's there were all of these sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken, a lot of implicit values and cultural elements about,
Yep.
the managers who are in the trenches, or the uh those folks that were not sort of ivory tower managers. You sort of, all of that was part of the folklore and myth within the organization, and that really created a culture where people didn't schedule one-on-ones with their direct reports. They didn't really try to coach or oversee their work or try to help them get better.
because of the
because
assumption of because of the mandate of flat.
exactly.
So essentially the organization, the leader is saying we have a flat organization, right? And that everybody kind of interprets it in a certain way. And what you're saying, this interpretation was it resulted in no one-on-ones, no direct, overseeing, no, all of the kind of accoutrement that come with the what it is to be a manager, right? They're misinterpreting what that might be. Did that
Exactly.
organization know, did the leaders know what flat was? I mean, did they have an aspiration? They're like, and they just didn't communicate it?
I think there was just I think there was a lack of communication and a lack of sort of clear communication. I think there's plenty of benefits to having a flatter
Sure.
organization. My
Sure.
interpretation of that kind of thing
Sure.
is that it's a little bit of a pendulum swing reaction from like very traditional corporate environments that feel
Yep.
bureaucratic and difficult to navigate, which aren't great either. And this is something that I talk about in the article where I really describe the framework. Is that with all of these things, there's there's sort of extremes on both ends where you can take something and over apply it, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's situations where you under apply it, and both are not great. You're sort of trying to strike a balance, and that's hard. And I think with those kinds of really corporate organizations that we can kind of imagine in our heads, the sort of Severance, if you've seen that show,
Yeah.
um, those are very stifling kind of difficult
Overly,
environments to operate
yeah,
in the
bureaucratic.
same
Yeah.
way that I compare this in the article. I talk a lot about how this kind of matches the way that governments work. And
Yep.
when you think about countries and governments that have a really strict top-down culture, those tend to be tyrannical sort of countries where everything from what you wear to what you say is being defined and controlled. That's not a great place to be. But the sort of complete opposite of that, which is we're going to have no sort of set
Right.
policies. We're not going to write down what our values are. It's totally kind of, open and unstructured. Bad things can come out of that too. It's about finding that middle ground to say, this
Yeah.
is sort of what we believe in, and this is the stuff that we don't compromise. And we're going to take some really good aspects of that flatness and openness and flexibility, but we're going to take some aspects of structure as well and clarity and expectations. And when you sort of figure out the right balance of that is I think when good things happen. And it's also just like not a box that you check. It's an ongoing
Yeah.
effort to try to get that balance right. And I think that's the other thing that organizations tend to get intimidated by or scared of is, well, it doesn't kind of feel right instinctively that we can just sit down and define a culture and ship it and we're done.
Yeah.
And so why try? And the point is, you're right. You're never going to be done, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. And that you sort of commit to the everyday of curating this culture as opposed to just letting it run wild.
It's not so much. I mean, it's almost like that flat. I mean, you can choose. It's fun. I mean, all right, okay, so you said it's not a great place to work if they're dictating X, Y, and Z. And I often say, I'm like, all right, listen, I don't think the way that Amazon builds its culture and runs is the right way to do it. But it doesn't mean that they shouldn't. That you can't argue with
Sure.
that success. I'm just not going to sign up for it. So it's like you can choose to be on one end or the other or somewhere in the middle. But what I think the point here is that regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, you need to be more explicit with what you expect, what you want. You can't just say, we're going to do this thing. Now we're going to be flat. Now we're going to use holacracy. Now we're going to use, top down. Now we're going to do the Six Sigma, whatever it might be, without actually explaining what the expectations are. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm going to have you describe this um the kind of the phases that you've implied
Yeah.
already. And they go from I think your term on the left was like abstract to concrete. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And basically you can think of these as almost like layers
I like
across an
layers.
organization.
Yep.
Um, and you can sort of open up each one of these layers to try to identify what I call gaps. And again, my background being learning design, and if there's any learning designers listening to this, you'll probably start to recognize some of the language I use. Um, it's very much inspired by a process that I go through as a learning designer all the time, which is essentially like a needs analysis where we say,
Mm,
great, we need to build this training. What are the objectives of that training? Well, in order to define that, I need to learn about who the audience is and what their gaps are. And so there might be a knowledge gap where that person needs a specific piece of information that they didn't have before, or it might be a skills gap where it's not just information, but it's an actual ability or behavior that they need to practice in a safe environment. And so you figure out all of these little gaps and you design a learning experience to close those gaps. And essentially what this framework is identifying the gaps that happen not in an individual but in a whole organization. And to your point exactly, it starts in the sort of most abstract end of the spectrum and it moves towards concrete, but it all sort of builds on each other. And so the most abstract, the sort of least tangible thing that we can hold in our hands is culture. It's and this is so much of what you have described in Great Mondays. It's kind of the air that we breathe. It's the stuff that informs our behaviors, our norms, our standards. It comprises everything from rituals to our values to the stories that we tell. Um, it's a lot of implicit stuff, a lot of explicit stuff, but it's ultimately culture is this kind of living and breathing thing. Um, One way that I usually talk about it with clients and other people in our field is that when you have two human beings working together, that's a relationship. When you add a third person or more, that's a culture. Like the dynamic that they develop between that group
hmm
is a culture. And there's subcultures, there's countercultures, right? Like these things all happen organically. And there's
Yep.
nothing you can do
Yep.
to stop it from developing, but there's plenty that you can do to sort of direct it in a certain direction. Um, so that's culture. And when you move sort of one notch up the concrete spectrum, you land on policies. And policies, the way that I sort of describe it, and that word, I think it can be a little bit deceiving.
Yeah.
It's less about like, parental leave policies or healthcare policies. Policies are essentially anything that is important enough within your culture that you write it down, that you make extremely explicit, where it's no longer spoken sort of word. It's no longer like a story that gets passed down. It's like a thing that is documented
Yeah.
and can be passed on. And so good examples of policies are just the idea that like management at, you know, Acme Inc. means meeting with your direct reports every week in a one-on-one. And
hmm
that's written in our handbook. That is an explicit expectation that's part of onboarding. It
Yep.
shows up places.
Yep.
Um, so yeah, that's a great example of a policy.
I'll
Values.
I'll stop.
Yeah.
I'll just interject and say, um, there's a moment in the life cycle of an organization, and this is often where I see the problem where, if you're just starting out and you are a company of three, maybe you don't need to write it down,
Hmm.
but you probably should. Right, I guess
Yeah.
that's kind of what I'm walking away from this, and it will evolve, and that's fine. But what happens is that what I've observed is that most leaders don't, or founders don't understand the importance of being explicit and codifying, is what I say, right?
Yeah.
Codifying it. And so
Exactly.
there's a moment when the company has grown and something happens, some sort of instigating event where it's either a crisis or a pressure point. You got to hire
Hmm.
more people, you got to get the next round of funding. You just got the round of funding, whatever it is, and you're like, "Uh-oh, people aren't acting the way that I was expecting," right? I had a client that once said, we had this, it's like, what happened to our no assholes policy?
Hmm.
or what happened to our open door policy? Well, it's like you didn't write it down. And so
Right.
every new person that you bring on, they don't know that. They don't have the time to absorb it. And you, as the founder, can't go around and spread that organically, anyways. And so
Exactly.
that to me is like where my experience resonates with this of you've got to identify what you want, and then which is I think the first part, which is culture. Like what are you
Hmm.
looking for? What is it the outcomes that you want, and the behaviors that drive those, and then you've got to codify them.
Yeah. And the cool thing about this framework is that all of these things connect to one another and they kind of go back and forth, right? Where like it's not like you have to have a perfect culture before you can think about your policies. Actually,
Yeah,
working through your policies
you're
will
never
help you
gonna.
refine. Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. You're never gonna. I
Um,
mean, yeah,
but
obvious.
that's exactly right to your point about like every new person that you add to your organization is going to make this work a little harder because it's almost like sort of planets circling each other. One new piece of body of mass is going to start influencing and adding to your culture in unexpected ways. That's
Yep.
always going to happen. And so your culture begins to evolve, but also to your point, you can't at a certain point communicate to everyone all of these sort of implicit
Yeah.
stories that have come. Like if it's not written down, it becomes so much harder to do that as you grow. And
Hmm.
so the best time to do it is when you're really small, because you can always change it, but you can't necessarily sort of put the toothpaste back in the tube after a
Yeah.
certain while. It just
Yeah.
becomes much harder.
All right. So we
um
started with
yeah.
culture.
Yep.
And then we go, so that's the most abstract. And then we've talked about policies. So now we're
Yes.
moving away from abstract and towards concrete. What's the next stop or next layer, as you've said?
Yeah, our next layer, our next sort of subway stop is programs. And programs are quite tangible because they're things that you see, that they're things that you experienced, that you can fund.
Yeah,
So
you
programs
can
are
buy, you can
yep,
participate in. Everybody knows what that is, right? Everybody's
yes,
been part of something in some capacity. And we started this conversation by saying, well, typically it's like we need to solve this problem. We're going to start a program of some type.
exactly. And so I think it's helpful to like use a few examples as we go throughout this. So a good example of a program is a monthly all hands town hall ritual that your company does, to share updates and things like that. So that's a program, that's a thing that people have to work on every month. It's on people's schedules. You have to buy catering for, right? Like that's a thing that you do. But the policy for that is, for example, let's say that one of your values is transparency, and that's an important thing for your organization. That value of transparency, which is something that is written down in your employee handbook, it's taught during onboarding, which is a whole separate program. That's a thing that is documented because it's so important to your company, and it has led you to create a program that essentially ensures transparency, and that's an all hands town hall. And that transparency policy is informed by your culture because you've decided that as a company that you want people to share information freely, that you want people to feel a sense of ownership over the success of the company, and that you know that transparency is the best way to get there. So you've written that down and you've created a program to support that. So that's an example of how all of these things kind of tie together. But yeah, manager trainings and workshops are programs. On employee onboarding is a program.
Mm-hmm.
They're basically all things that you um, have actively put together that people work on, that has infrastructure, that has spending, and things like that.
But the problem is when not to, beat a dead horse, but the problem is that when someone says we need an onboarding,
Mhm.
they haven't typically defined the policy
Right.
or the culture, the outcomes that they
Yes.
want.
Yeah, exactly. And that is exactly the sort of problem I found, is that we often start at programs. That's the sort of stop one on the train when it really should have been culture, when it really should have been policies. And so we think, well, yeah, we probably need an onboarding because we need to help people set up their accounts, and we need to give them
Right.
computers,
Right.
because like you literally can't do work without those things. And then you realize, well,
Oh,
actually,
wait a minute. Yeah.
like an employee onboarding is the best time, and you mentioned this in Great Mondays, right? It's the best time to share your values with somebody. It's the best opportunity to tell a story about, like, what are we other than like a profit machine? Like, why are we doing what we
Yeah.
do? What are
Yeah.
our values? What is our mission? That's the time to share it. That's the time to make your culture as explicit as possible. And people will take that on and run with it. I sort of learned this. I didn't realize I was learning it, but I learned this at Apple when I was working there. Within Apple retail, at least, the onboarding process is a 3-day long experience, which I think is like unheard of in most companies. Most other places I've worked in, I've been told to keep onboarding down to 2 hours, right? And what does that say about
Yeah.
how much you value your culture? Is like, let's make this the smallest part of a new employee's experience.
How quickly can
Um,
you start creating value for our customers and our
yeah,
company, right?
exactly.
Like, but you're like, go slow. To me, go slow. It's go slow to go fast.
Yeah. The impact that great onboarding has on employee engagement and retention and all of that is honestly, um, the return on investment on onboarding, I think, is just off the charts.
Yep.
That is the time to invest,
Yep.
because it will make a difference for years. Um, I've worked with clients where there was such little onboarding that you would talk to employees who had been there for 2 years, 3 years, who couldn't tell you how the company started, when it started. They didn't really understand. There's that question of like, I don't know what our culture is. And
Yeah.
it's because nothing was made explicit. It was just, you'll sort of figure it out when you get here, and it's all sort of left to chance.
Yeah. All right. So culture, policies, programs, one more stop, the most tactical layer.
Yeah, it's the most concrete, and that's tools. And tools are pretty much, this is probably the most literal name in contrast to policy. It's literally the software and the hardware and the environment, the physical environment around us,
Hmm.
that people need to be able to operate in. And again, this is a place where it's really important. And it's one of those places where we spend probably too much time and also not enough time. And this is the example that I give in the article. Is I've experienced this myself, where you work somewhere and you're constantly having collaboration problems, or you're constantly having communication problems,
Uh-huh.
where things are getting missed and people are like, where do I find that file? And it's really frustrating. And people jump to, well, our project management tool doesn't work, or we need a new communication tool to be
Hmm.
able to fix these things. And you spend months researching the right tools, and you go through all the sort of procurement process, and you pay thousands of dollars to install this new tool, and nobody uses it and it doesn't work, and you go through the whole process again in a year. And the reason you go through that is because you're not dealing with the real problems. You're not dealing with the cultural problems, the policy problems that are leading to issues around collaboration, communication. Um, and so if you're just swapping out the tools, it's
Yeah.
not going to solve it for you. Um, so that's why we spend too much time on it. The ways in which we spend too little time on it is, there are a lot of things, a lot of behaviors or activities, or essentially tasks that we have to do that can be made so much easier with the right tools. And we don't often provide the right tools. And so, the example that I was giving a little bit earlier is, we expect people to give feedback. We expect people to give specific, actionable feedback, but very rarely do we provide people the right tools to capture that, or to keep track of things in the long term.
Hmm.
And that's tremendously useful, because it's hard, from a cognitive load perspective. As a manager, I have 5 direct reports. I'm noticing all of these things every single day, but I'm probably not writing them down. I'm not capturing it. And so it's those types of things that tools can really come in. And if you have the right culture, the right policies, you've set up the right programs, a tool can come in and make it 10 times easier for people to actually do what they're supposed to do. Um, and we are often not finding the right tools for that. So it's sort of the least exciting kind of
Yeah.
layer, but it's a
Yeah.
really important one. And again, it's a place that people often start with, and you really have to start much lower in the spectrum to think about maybe the reason we're not communicating well enough isn't because we're debating between MS Teams or Slack or whatever. It's because of the culture of communication we've set up or the expectations that we've never shared about what good communication looks like.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. So it's how come these things are getting missed? It's because of communication. Well, do we know what is expected of communication within this organization? And as I'm saying that, my fear is that it's assumption that is undermining all of this. Oh, well,
Mm-hmm.
the way that we did it X, Y, and Z, or every organization, you should just communicate like this. I mean, I guess that's fine. You can copy it, but you still have to be explicit. You can't just presume. And then I think we get into it's going to take a lot of time. But ultimately, I mean, just like any good research project, to get that functionality right in that software or whatever it might be, you need to back it up and back it up and back it up and start with, well, what is the outcome of good communication that we want, right? What is it that we're looking for? Is it, this is an example I use all the time, right? Speed or innovation? Because those two
Mm-hmm.
things can often be at odds with one another. And so, what is, do we want to focus on experiments and iteration, or do we want to focus on efficiency and productivity at the cultural level? And then we have to
Right.
say, okay, if that is the case, then these are the behaviors that we need in order to drive those outcomes. That's the policy. And then, okay, so do people need to learn this? Well, they at least need to
Right.
understand that this is, at the very least, right? Let's just say it's a behavior that people know how to do. You don't have to teach them any specific skill. You need a program to at least introduce this concept of how we're going to go forward with that. Is that a correct way to think about this?
Totally. One thing that I've been doing more of in within human machine and my work, that I'm really excited about is working with teams. And this is this is outside of this framework, but another realization I had with learning and development, which is that we focus so much on individual skills gaps. So we say sort of, what do all of these individual people need behavior wise to help them do the task that is in front of them? And what we do less of is think about, what do we need to do with this group of people, this collective of people that we've put together to help them do it together.
Mm.
And to your point,
Hmm.
right, developing a program where it's not so much about teaching people how to do something, but just communicating the expectation and having conversations that make the assumptions much more explicit. So, one of the things that I'm doing more of is, when was the last time that, say, you're going to kick off a new project and you're putting a team together so that they go work on a new feature for a product. And before they start working together, you get them in a room and you have a really uh, clear conversation about aligning on the goal of this new feature, figuring out how are we going to go about it? How are we going to communicate with one another? What does it look like to give feedback in this team? Um, how do we handle it when we disagree or when things go wrong? Like, I can't think of almost any time in my entire career when a meeting like that was held
Yeah.
explicitly and preemptively. I've been in plenty of postmortems.
Yeah.
I've been in plenty of meetings where like things did not go well.
Yeah.
Why? But what if we did that before things went badly? What if we did it at the beginning of projects so that it's not about learning a new skill? It's about aligning a group of human beings with slightly different expectations or things that are unspoken and just making it really clear to say, we know we're going to disagree at some point. That's okay and normal. That's not a scary thing or a
Yeah.
sign that things are going poorly. Um, but how are we going to handle it? How are we going to overcome those difficulties? And let's decide it now before we're resentful or frustrated or mad at each other, so that when it happens, we know exactly what to do. Or at least we've built up that kind of goodwill and collaboration to figure it out in the
Yeah.
moment. So that's really exciting to me, and I still see that as learning and development. I still see that as learning design.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not about a new skill. It's about getting a group of people to work really well together because everybody knows sort of where they are and what the dynamic is and how they're contributing
Yeah.
and sort of working together. Yeah.
This to me is going to become one of the key features of really great companies and teams in the next couple of years. I think you can call them a couple different things. I think what we're talking about can be described as team level agreements. So if you're working on a team consistently, this is how we interpret the culture, the organization level culture, but we need also the team level culture.
Mm-hmm.
And also more and more it's project teams, and so every time there's a new project you need to have this um, project kickoff needs to start with not dates and deliverables,
Yep.
but needs to start with a almost like a project mission statement and an establishment of the culture, how explicitly, so taking this idea right of explicit agreements and understanding, explicitly saying this is how this project is going to work, this is how we're going to interact, this is how we're going to work together as we're as an organism. This is what we're looking to do, which means that we're going to engage with one another. And so I feel like there's a fractal nature of this,
Yeah.
right? Where you have the four components of this: culture, policies, programs, tools. Well, let's establish that for each project that we're starting. And then once that project's over, great. We go away, we've learned something. We can bring that back as a template, but then make some changes. And to me,
Totally.
there's a the pace of change inside of organizations is so rapid now that it is not just establish the culture and then maybe we can evolve it, which is I think a requirement, but it's also establish the culture and then revise the culture and then establish it again and then let's work here and how do we do this thing. And it can feel onerous, but in fact, there's really no other appropriate way to succeed in the kind of environment that we're all, screaming headlong into, which is just radical change every day of every week of every month.
Yes. And it's, to your point around it feeling onerous, the funny thing, and this is another kind of light bulb moment for me that I kind of realized that there was something to this framework is there's not that many other analogs. There's not that many other examples of groups of human beings working together that do it the way that business does it. And that seems weird that business is almost sort of the outlier to it. So when you think about great sports teams, for example, the idea that you would get a bunch of people together who would never work together and tell them, all right, here's how this is going to work. By the end of this year, we're going to have won 3 trophies. Now go out there and play a game together and just like do your individual best. It would be a disaster. No sports team handles it that way, right? Like you have to practice together. You have to do things outside of when it really counts to know who each other are and understand each other's strengths and talk a lot about the identity of our team and what we bring to it. It would be sort of completely wild to imagine we're just going to throw people out there and assume it's going to go well. But we
We're
do that
gonna
in
we're
business
gonna
all the
tell them
time.
we're gonna tell them the quarterly or the season goal, the seasonal goal, and then we're also gonna give you um some basketballs and some shoes
Yeah.
and some recovery equipment. Go.
And good luck.
Good
And
luck.
I will only coach each one of you individually. I will only talk to each player by
Yeah.
themselves. We
Yeah.
will not talk, it's like it just would never work. And if somebody tried to do it, it would be seen as a bit of an absurd way to approach it.
That is
But
so clarifying.
every single day we're doing this in business, which doesn't seem to make sense to me. Um, it's so it does seem onerous, but at the same time, I actually think it's a pretty well uh sort of drilled thing, and it happens in so many different industries.
Yeah.
um and it's funny, it is interesting how when I bring this up with clients, when I try to do it, there is that initial feeling of, wait, why do we have to sit in a room and explicitly describe how we're going to give feedback to each other? I also think about this in
Isn't this why I hired a professional, right?
exactly. It's like, shouldn't people just know how to do that? And I think this is also like being in a relationship or being in a marriage, you learn this too, is that like I've been together with my wife now for 12 years, and we're still figuring out like, oh, this is how you prefer to receive feedback, or like this type of communication is hard for you. And that's over 12 years, right? Most people don't work at companies for 12 years. You're working with people
Yeah.
who you've met a few months ago or a year ago. And if you're not having those explicit conversations, it would take you many lifetimes to get to a place where you know that person deeply enough to know exactly how they like to work and how they take
Yeah.
feedback. Um, if a 12-year long marriage still requires those kinds of really explicit conversations, what does that say about our working and colleague relationships that are much shorter, with which with much less sort of contact time, in which we're not having those conversations at all? So yeah,
Yeah.
it just seems very clear to me that there's tremendous benefit to making this stuff really explicit, and there's practically no benefit to continuing to sort of make assumptions or not really deliberately work on our culture, our policies, and uh, all of these layers.
Last little thread I want to tug on before we wrap this up. Um, which layer do I start on? I mean, I think theoretically you want to say culture, but I don't think I mean that's what I would say, but I think as you and I have had a few different conversations, I don't think
Yeah,
practically that's how people, that's how organizations, that's how leaders are going to be able to start. They're going to have to enter somewhere else. How do I get started on this?
yeah, I think that's a great question. What I see most often is that people start where it hurts. And you mentioned this a
Mm,
little bit earlier in the conversation, right? It's often due to a crisis, or it's often due to some sort of event or pressure point where people begin to realize these things. And it would be great if all of us from day one of a company or day one of a team just proactively built this beautiful garden. But that's not the reality most of the time. And so start pulling the thread of where you're feeling that pain point, and being the L&D person, being the person that's often responsible for programs. That felt easy to me because and to this day, I often will get a client, and my first engagement with them will be a conversation about, well, we need a communication styles workshop because we're not communicating well enough. So clearly that's the pain point that they're feeling, and they're trying to treat that pain point via a program for me. And I don't want to turn anybody down. I say, of course, like we can totally put together a great communication styles workshop. But before we do that, let's actually explore this a little bit deeper. Let's try to pull the thread on this pain point, because what we might find is that it's not that your people don't know how to communicate, it's that there are norms that you've established that you maybe didn't even realize were established. There's expectations, there's all sorts of different things that have led to these problems, and we need to start there first. So often I'll do a town hall session before a workshop where it's just an opportunity for employees to share, when it comes to communication, what have you struggled with? What have you found difficult? What are the sort of roadblocks? And as people begin to express those things, it starts lighting up kind of the switchboard across the spectrum. You start to realize, oh, it's hard because when this person tries to give an honest opinion, they're sort of immediately shut down. That's a cultural thing. Like we have to address that through culture. You sort of start to see where all of the little
mhm.
areas are that need to get worked on. And then it's just a matter of working through it. So I would say this the starting point is wherever you feel that gap exists, and then not jumping immediately into it, but approaching it with a sense of openness and curiosity, and starting to pull that
Mm.
thread to say, okay, well, it feels like we're missing the skills, but before I immediately jump to that, let's dig deeper and figure out if there's more here than meets the eye.
Amazing. Andre Plaut of Learning of Human Machine, a learning design strategist. Amazing to talk to you. You can find more out about him and his work at ahumanmachine.com. Andre, it's amazing to talk to you. Thank you so much for writing this piece and thinking about this so thoroughly. I think I said before, there's not a day that's going to go by for the rest of my life that I don't think about what you've described. So thank you so much for that. And thanks for coming by Great Mondays Radio.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you for everything that you've done around culture. And yeah, thank you for having me.